The night felt special. There was something in the air, a kind of quiet excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. My wife's message had been brief but intriguing. She wanted me to meet her at a fancy restaurant. She said she had a big surprise for me, and her tone was unusually upbeat. After 23 years of marriage, surprises weren't something we often indulged in anymore. Life had become predictable, comfortable, even monotonous at times. But I never thought of that as a bad thing. Stability was a blessing, or so I had thought. The restaurant she picked was an upscale place, much fancier than anywhere we usually went. I remember brushing off the faint feeling of unease as I adjusted my tie in the car. Maybe she wanted to rekindle some romance. Maybe this was her way of showing she appreciated me. I smiled at the thought. A surprise like that would have been nice, something to break the routine we had settled into over the years. As I walked through the doors, I immediately felt out of place. The room was filled with people who exuded confidence and wealth, and the dim lighting added an air of exclusivity to the atmosphere. I scanned the tables, searching for her, and my eyes landed on a familiar figure. She was sitting in a cozy booth near the back, but she wasn't alone. My steps faltered, and a strange chill ran through me. Sitting across from her was my best friend. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was part of the surprise. Maybe he had helped her plan something for me. But as I stood there unnoticed, I couldn't ignore the way they looked at each other. Their smiles were too intimate, too knowing. I approached the table, my heart pounding in my chest. When she finally noticed me, her expression didn't change. There was no guilt, no remorse, just a calm, practiced indifference. She didn't bother with pleasantries or even an explanation. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the table toward me. "These are the divorce papers," she said, her voice steady, almost businesslike. For a moment, I couldn't process her words. Divorce papers? What was she talking about? She didn't give me time to respond. She continued, each word cutting deeper than the last. She told me she had moved all our savings into her account. She told me she didn't need me anymore. She told me she was done with our marriage. Her words felt like blows, each one landing harder than the last. I stared at her, trying to find a trace of the woman I had spent more than 2 decades with. The woman I had built a life with, shared dreams with, raised children with. But the person sitting in front of me was a stranger. Then she said something that took the pain to a whole new level. She gestured to my best friend and declared that he was her future. They were going on a romantic honeymoon, she added, and she was leaving for good. The air felt heavy, suffocating. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a complete erasure of everything we had built together. What hurt the most wasn't just her actions. It was the ease with which she dismissed our entire life together. 23 years of marriage, of shared struggles and victories, of raising our children reduced to a few cold sentences and a stack of legal documents. As if that wasn't enough, she added one final blow. "You can keep the kids," she said, her tone so casual it made my blood boil. Keep the kids, as if they were possessions to be handed off, burdens she was relieved to be rid of. They stood up together and I watched as they prepared to leave. My best friend, if I could even call him that anymore, avoided my gaze, but his smirk betrayed his lack of shame. They looked at each other and laughed, as if this were just another amusing chapter in their story. I wanted to say something, to yell, to demand answers, but I was frozen in place, stunned by the sheer audacity of it all. My hands trembled as I picked up the divorce papers, my vision blurred by a mix of anger and disbelief. As they walked out of the restaurant, arm in arm, I sat there alone, drowning in a sea of emotions. Betrayal, humiliation, rage, grief. It all hit me at once, a tidal wave of pain that threatened to pull me under. The waiter approached, asking if I was ready to order, but I could barely respond. I just shook my head, unable to form words. The world around me moved on, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. In that moment, I felt utterly alone. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my friendships, it had all been a lie. And as I sat there, clutching those papers, I realized that the life I had known was over. But even in the depths of that despair, a small, quiet thought began to take shape. This wasn't going to be the end of my story. Not like this. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, each one hitting me like a relentless wave. The shock of that night lingered, replaying in my mind on an endless loop. I couldn't escape it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her sliding the divorce papers across the table. Heard her voice cutting through the air as she declared that she was done with me. Every time I tried to focus on anything else, the image of her walking out of the restaurant, arm in arm with the man I had trusted like a brother, would surface and pull me under again. The house felt emptier than ever, even though nothing had physically changed. The same furniture, the same pictures on the walls, the same faint scent of her perfume that still lingered in the air. Yet it all felt hollow. The warmth that had once defined our home had been snuffed out in an instant, leaving behind only a cold, suffocating silence. I spent hours sitting in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. My thoughts spiraled, jumping from one painful realization to the next. How long had this been going on? Had she been pretending to love me for months? Years? Had every kind word, every touch, every shared laugh been a lie? The weight of those questions crushed me, but there were no answers. Only the emptiness of betrayal. The betrayal wasn't hers alone. My best friend, or the man I thought he was, had played an equal role in this. I trusted him with everything. He had been there through some of the most important moments of my life, standing by my side during weddings, funerals, and celebrations, and all the while he was stabbing me in the back. The realization of his betrayal was a fresh wound, layered on top of the one my wife had inflicted. I replayed countless moments in my head, searching for signs I might have missed. The glances they shared when they thought no one was looking. The inside jokes that made me feel like an outsider in my own life. The excuses she made when she stayed out late or when he suddenly stopped by for no reason at all. How could I have been so blind? It was as though every memory I had of them was now tainted, warped by the knowledge of what had been happening behind my back. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed alone, I could hear every creak of the house, every faint rustle of the wind outside. Sleep eluded me. My mind refused to quiet down, and the pain seemed sharper in the stillness of the dark. Memories of our life together, our wedding day, the births of our children, the milestones we had celebrated would flood my mind, only to be overshadowed by the bitter truth. She had erased it all with her actions, as if those years meant nothing to her. The anger started to grow, a low, simmering rage that built with each passing day. At first it was directed at her, at the way she had so easily discarded me, our marriage, and our family. But soon it turned inward. I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting her, for believing in the life we had built together. I questioned everything about myself, my judgment, my worth, my ability to move forward. I tried to find moments of clarity, but they were fleeting. Every time I thought I was starting to process what had happened, something would drag me back. A picture on the mantle of us smiling together. A text from a mutual friend asking if I was okay. A piece of her clothing that she had left behind. It was like trying to heal from a wound that kept being reopened, over and over again. One morning I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as it gurgled and hissed. The mundane sound was almost comforting in its normalcy, a brief reminder that life outside of my pain continued on. But as I stood there, a wave of despair crashed over me. This was my life now, empty, fractured, and unrecognizable. The woman I had loved for more than 2 decades had shattered it, and I was left to pick up the pieces. Amid the pain, I couldn't stop thinking about the children. They had no idea what was happening yet, and I dreaded the moment I would have to tell them. How could I explain that their mother had chosen to walk away from us, that she had decided we weren't enough for her anymore? The thought of their faces, their confusion and hurt, was almost too much to bear. But I knew I had to be strong for them, even if I felt anything but. I spent those days in a fog, going through the motions of life without truly living. Eating felt like a chore, conversations felt forced, smiling felt impossible. But through it all, a small part of me began to whisper that this couldn't last forever. The pain, the anger, the sadness, they couldn't define me forever. As much as it hurt, I realized that my wife's actions had forced me to confront a harsh truth. The life I thought I had was gone, and there was no going back. The only choice left was to figure out how to move forward, even if I didn't know what that looked like yet. It was a faint glimmer of hope, buried beneath the weight of betrayal, but it was there. And for now, that would have to be enough. Weeks had passed since that devastating night, but the wounds were still fresh, raw, and unrelenting. Just as I was beginning to catch my breath, to piece together some semblance of what life might look like going forward, she reached out again. At first, I thought it might be an apology or perhaps an attempt at reconciliation, not because I wanted it, but because a part of me still expected some trace of decency. That hope, however small, was quickly crushed. Her demand was unlike anything I could have anticipated. She wanted me to adopt her unborn child. Not just any child, her affair partner's child. My mind went blank for a moment when I first read the message. The audacity of it, the sheer arrogance was staggering. She had betrayed me in the most profound way possible, abandoned our family, humiliated me publicly, and now she was asking me to take responsibility for a child that wasn't mine, conceived during the destruction of our marriage. I sat in silence for a long time, the message still open on my phone. The disbelief slowly gave way to anger. How could she possibly think I would agree to this? Had she lost all sense of reality, or had she always seen me as someone she could manipulate, someone she could burden with her mistakes while she moved on with her new life? Her words were phrased casually, almost flippantly, as though it were a reasonable request and not the most insulting thing she could have asked of me. What struck me most was the lack of accountability. She didn't acknowledge what she had done or the pain she had caused. There was no remorse, no hint of understanding the gravity of her actions. Instead, she seemed to view me as an afterthought, a convenient solution to a problem she didn't want to deal with. It was as if my feelings, my dignity, and my boundaries didn't matter. The thought of her future child brought on a whirlwind of emotions. It wasn't the baby's fault, it was innocent, oblivious to the circumstances of its conception. But the very idea of raising that child, of being reminded every single day of what she had done, was unbearable. It wasn't about revenge or spite, it was about self-preservation. Agreeing to her demand would mean sacrificing what little was left of my identity, my peace, and my ability to move forward. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about the child, it was about control. By asking me to adopt her baby, she was trying to tether me to her chaos, to keep me tied to her narrative even after she had walked away. It was a way to maintain power over me, to ensure that I remained a player in the story she had rewritten for herself. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. I thought about the life we had built together, the sacrifices I had made, the loyalty I had shown. I thought about the version of her I had fallen in love with, the woman who had seemed so full of warmth and promise, and then I thought about the woman she had become, selfish, cruel, and completely devoid of empathy. It was as if the person I had loved for 23 years had been an illusion, and the real her had only now revealed herself. I couldn't help but think about our children. They were old enough to sense that something was wrong, even if they didn't know the full extent of it yet. How would they feel when they learned the truth? How would they process the fact that their mother had chosen to walk away not just from me, but from them as well? They were my priority now, and I knew I had to protect them from the fallout as much as possible. Her demand for me to adopt her affair baby only reinforced what I already knew. She had completely abdicated her responsibilities, not just as a wife, but as a mother. She had decided to chase her own happiness at any cost, leaving me to pick up the pieces. But I wasn't going to let her drag me down any further. I didn't respond to her request right away. Instead, I took time to process what it meant for me and for my future. I sought legal advice to ensure I was on solid ground, knowing full well that she might try to twist the situation to her advantage. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could control me anymore. Eventually, I made my decision. I sent her a clear, concise response: no. No, I would not adopt her child. No, I would not take on the burden of her choices. No, I would not allow her to dictate the terms of my life any longer. Her reaction was predictable. She lashed out, accusing me of being selfish, of not caring about the baby or her situation. But her words held no power over me anymore. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, a sense of strength. I had drawn a line, and I wasn't going to let her cross it. The experience was a turning point for me. It forced me to confront the reality of who she was and to accept that she wasn't the person I had once believed her to be. It also reaffirmed my commitment to myself and to my children. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control how I responded, and I chose to move forward, leaving her and her chaos behind. The moment I sent that final no to her outrageous demand, it was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For weeks I had been drowning in pain, betrayal, and anger, but in that single, decisive act, I began to reclaim a small piece of myself. It wasn't much, just a spark, but it was enough to remind me that I still had control over my life, even if it didn't feel like it at times. From that point onward, my focus shifted. I realized I had been so consumed by what she had done to me, by the injustice of it all, that I had neglected the people who truly mattered, my children. They were the ones who needed me the most, and I wasn't going to let my own grief blind me to their pain. They had already lost so much, first their mother's love, and now the stability of the family they had always known. I couldn't let them lose me too. Telling them the truth about what had happened was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I didn't want to burden them with the full weight of the betrayal, but I also didn't want to lie to them. They deserved honesty, even if it hurt. Sitting them down in the living room, I chose my words carefully, explaining in the simplest terms that their mother had made a choice to leave and that as a result, things were going to be different from now on. Their reactions broke me all over again. My oldest tried to act strong, putting on a brave face even as his eyes brimmed with tears. My youngest couldn't hide her devastation, sobbing into my chest as I held her tightly. It was in that moment that I made a promise to myself and to them. I would do whatever it took to make sure they felt loved, supported, and safe. No matter how broken I felt inside, I couldn't let them see it. They needed stability, and I was determined to provide it for them. The days that followed were a balancing act. I threw myself into being there for my children, trying to fill the void their mother had left behind. I helped with homework, cooked their favorite meals, and spent hours listening to their fears and frustrations. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I felt like I had nothing left to give, when the loneliness and anger would creep back in and threatened to overwhelm me. But every time I looked at their faces, I found the strength to keep going. At the same time, I began to take steps to rebuild my own life. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything to her. It was about finding myself again. For so long, my identity had been tied to being her husband, to being part of a family unit that no longer existed. Now, I had to figure out who I was without her. I started small, taking time to focus on things that brought me even the smallest bit of joy. I went for long walks in the mornings, letting the fresh air and the quiet give me space to think. I rediscovered old hobbies I had abandoned years ago, like woodworking and reading. These simple acts felt like lifelines, small but meaningful ways to remind myself that life could still hold beauty, even in the midst of so much pain. One of the biggest challenges was dealing with the financial fallout. She had drained our savings, leaving me to scramble to keep everything afloat. I worked harder than ever, picking up extra hours and taking on side projects just to make sure the bills were paid and my children had what they needed. It was exhausting, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving forward instead of standing still. There were moments, of course, when the bitterness would creep back in. Seeing her social media posts flaunting her new life with him felt like salt in the wound. They were carefree, smiling, as if they hadn't left a trail of destruction behind them. But over time, I found myself caring less and less. Their happiness, or the illusion of it, was no longer my concern. My energy was better spent on my own healing, on creating a future for myself and my kids. What surprised me most during this time was the support I received from unexpected places. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to check on me, offering kind words and a listening ear. Even neighbors and coworkers, people who barely knew me, showed more compassion and empathy than I had ever expected. Their kindness reminded me that not everyone in the world was cruel or selfish, and it gave me hope that there were still good people out there. Slowly but surely, life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before, and it never would be, but it was ours. The kids and I formed our own little team, leaning on each other and finding moments of joy in the midst of the chaos. We laughed more, cried less, and started to look toward the future with cautious optimism. I wouldn't say I was completely healed, not yet anyway. The scars from what she had done would always be there, a reminder of a chapter in my life that I could never erase. But I was learning to accept them, to see them not as symbols of weakness or failure, but as proof that I had survived. And in that survival, I found strength I never knew I had. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain, though it doesn't erase it completely. In the months that followed, I learned to coexist with the heartbreak. It became like a low hum in the background, always there but no longer consuming me. I had reached a point where I wasn't just surviving, I was starting to rebuild, brick by brick, a life that was entirely my own. The kids and I had found a rhythm that worked for us. They were my anchor, giving me purpose and grounding me when the weight of everything threatened to pull me under. I focused on creating a stable, loving home for them, where they felt safe and valued. We cooked meals together, played games on weekends, and had movie nights where we'd laugh until our sides hurt. Slowly, our house began to feel like a home again, not because of her absence, but because of the love we were pouring into it as a family. The turning point came when I realized I was no longer living in the shadow of her betrayal. It wasn't that I had forgotten what she did, how could I? But I was no longer letting it define me. I wasn't the man whose wife had left him for his best friend. I wasn't the man she had betrayed or abandoned. I was just me, a father, a provider, and a person who had been forced to rediscover himself after being shattered. I was essentially leaving Portland to refuse a place in the desert to her son. I was still hurt. I was still sad. Her attempts to reach out eventually stopped. After I refused to adopt her child, she tried a few more times to draw me back into her chaos. Emails, texts, messages through mutual acquaintances. But each time, I responded with silence. At first, ignoring her felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to reclaim the power she had taken from me. But as time went on, it became something more, an act of self-respect. I didn't need her explanations or excuses. I didn't need her drama. I was done being a part of her life, and I had no interest in letting her be a part of mine. I did hear through the grapevine that things weren't going as perfectly for her and him as she had likely envisioned. Friends mentioned whispers of tension, rumors that their honeymoon phase had come to an abrupt end. A part of me felt vindicated by the news. After all, they had destroyed 2 families to be together. But mostly, I felt indifferent. Their problems were theirs to deal with, and I had no intention of giving them any more space in my mind. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt without her. It was like stepping out of a storm and realizing I had been carrying an umbrella with holes in it the entire time. With her gone, I was no longer walking on eggshells or bending over backward to meet her impossible standards. I could breathe again, free from her criticism, manipulation, and the constant feeling that I wasn't enough. As soon as I felt safe without her in my life, I was able to move on. I started to focus on myself in ways I hadn't in years. For so long, my identity had been tied to being her husband, to keeping her happy, to holding our family together. Now I had the chance to figure out who I was outside of all that. I joined a local gym, Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because it felt good to take care of my body. I took up photography, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the time for. And I reconnected with old friends, people I had unintentionally drifted away from during the years when my marriage consumed so much of my energy. The kids were thriving too. They still had moments of sadness and confusion, how could they not? But they were resilient in a way that only children can be. Watching them grow stronger and more confident reminded me of why I was doing all of this. They were my reason to keep going, my reason to get up every morning and keep pushing forward. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the quiet of the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The pain, the betrayal, the chaos, it was all still there, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for what she had done, but for what it had taught me. She had broken me, yes, but in breaking me, she had forced me to rebuild myself stronger. I had learned how to set boundaries, how to stand up for myself, and how to prioritize my own happiness. I had discovered that I was capable of more than I ever thought possible, and I had found a resilience within me that I hadn't known existed. Looking back, I realized that the version of my life I had been clinging to was never as perfect as I thought it was. There were cracks in the foundation long before she shattered it completely. But now, I had the chance to build something new, something better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. As the months turned into a year, the pain faded even further into the background. It would always be a part of my story, a scar that marked a painful chapter in my life, but it was just that, a chapter. The rest of the book was still unwritten, and I was finally ready to pick up the pen.